back at it with a different knitting needle. This one is also metal, happens to be nickel-plated brass. So I had dropped a few already here. We'll worry about those later. But let's grab these. They have to sort of be grabbed individually. As the needle or hook goes down and there isn't any additional yarn to catch, the stitches will come off of the machine and you can catch them with a knitting needle. This one's probably the thinnest I would use. It's a 1. I wouldn't try a 0 only because zeros tend to be variable in their dimensions, and I'd be concerned that if your 0 was from a different set than mine, you might snap it. I have tried using wooden knitting needles for this purpose. They do not work because you spend so much time manipulating them that you could break off the tip, you could break the actual needle in half, it may become separated from its cable, and I definitely wouldn't use my best Addi clicks on this task either. This just happens to be an Addi that I have that's probably one of the first needles I ever bought, and it's perfect for this purpose. I don't really use it for much because now I have my interchangeables. So if it were to get damaged in this process, I'd be sad, but I wouldn't be heartbroken. So this is just as painstaking as using this machine is, pulling the stitches off, but at least the reward when we get them off of here is we don't have to put them back on, because that would just be torture. So give me a couple more minutes here. I'll actually speed it up so you're not tortured by all 40 some odd pins. So those of you that really knit will know that pulling the knitting off of one of those machines, you never really know what you're going to get. So the best thing to do is to walk yourself back a few rounds, pick a point where the work is remotely tolerable, and use the other side of the needle to go back through the stitches that are further down in that other round, because that way you get rid of all of this area here where the tension was just messed up on the last few rounds of work. That's why when using one of those wretched machines, I always suggest make your work a little bit longer than it needs to be, and then go back to finish it using a proper knitting technique and a proper set of knitting needles so you get a nice edge. Sure, people will still know that it wasn't really knit, it was made on a machine, but at least it will look a little bit more professional as opposed to homemade. So I'm going to continue doing that now and be back with you in a couple minutes. Alright, now that the work is all on one needle, it is too small of a needle to truly continue at some semblance of the correct gauge. It doesn't need to be perfect at this point. What we just want to be able to do is to put an eyelet around the edge that we can put a ribbon through. And to do that, I chose to use a US 9. You could probably use a different size. I am just going to knit one round here. So that I get all of my stitches onto a needle of approximately the right size and gauge. Remember, the reason we used this old number 1 here was because we wanted to use something that would allow us to pick the stitches out of that wretched machine. So we did that, took off a few of the last rounds just because as they were being pulled and manipulated off of the machine, it did affect our gauge. And the good thing about taking off a few rounds is that we now know that we have enough yarn to continue what we were going to do, which was to put on that edge we talked about as a proper knit edge as opposed to either pulling it or leaving it ragged. So we'll go all the way around once, just so all of the stitches are on the needle that we want to use to do the rest of the work. Now the needle that we are working from, being the smaller one, is not relevant to our finished product because the stitches that we're making now, we are making with the proper size needle for the rest of our project, which is the 9. Remember, your stitches are determined by the tension with which you hold the yarn and the needle with which you work. In other words, since I'm really only working with the yarn going from my left to my right, the size that matters is the size that is in my right hand. The left is simply just holding the stitches. So we'll let it continue to do that. As we work the rest of the stitches. This is a 48 pin machine, so there are 48 stitches that need to be worked, unless I drop some, which is entirely possible. Now, let's get that needle out of the way. And I'm actually using a needle that's too big, but I want you to do that so that you can see how much this tube will stretch. So I did transition to a smaller needle just because I think when you're working, you will most likely be using a smaller needle and it will be easier to see. So here's my two together, here's my last yarn over, and now I'm just going to go all the way around, one round, and what this will do is it will create an eyelet round. And that eyelet round is where we will put through the ribbon or I-cord to finish the project at the end. The other end is simply pulled taut, like you would pull the end of a hat, because the way that the knitting machine works is that it leaves you with live stitches, not unlike you would have in the last round of a hat. So since the machine binding off is precarious at best, it's just easiest to do it with a pair of knitting needles properly. And then for the live stitches at the beginning of the work, you can either elect to pick them up and knit them, or you could sew them using a sewing machine, or you could pull them taut as I have done. And it just sort of looks like the top of a hat. I'll just weave in that in like I would weave in the end of a hat. Now, meanwhile, at the beginning of my round again, we see these lovely little eyelets. And now here, I would like to actually be a little fancy. And I'm going to use a sweet little I-cord bind off on the end. So I've put on my 3 stitches. 1, 2. Knit these 2 together. Slide these 3 back. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Knit these 2 together. 1, 2, 3. You can just bind off if you'd like. I just happen to like the way the I-cord bind off looks at the top of a gift bag. So I thought I would use that for this, which is going to be a yoga bag. Might as well get started on those New Year's resolutions to be fit a day or 2 early. I'll finish this and be right back.